Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 11, Section 3, Native Americans. So we're going to begin by talking a little bit about what was happening here on the plains. How did most Native Americans live on the Great Plains? Well, they lived as nomads who typically followed their main food source, which were the buffalo. And one actions took a serious toll on Native Americans. Many of them were harmed by deprivation of hunting grounds when they were forced to go to reservations. The treaties that they had signed that were broken by the government or by settlers enforced relocation into reservations or into new territories. So, I want to talk a little bit about the provisions of two treaties of Fort Laramie. And some of these provisions are the things that kind of lead to some of the discrepancies between the Lakota Sioux and the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes that were probably more notorious for fighting this whole idea of moving to the reservations. So, the original Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed in 1851, and this is just a couple of years after the discovery of gold in California. And this treaty, for the most part, basically said that the government has the right to establish roads and military outposts. That would basically be like a fort wherever they wanted within the territory. The Sioux would be given lands, which would basically be from present day Missouri River in South Dakota, south to present day North Platte, Nebraska, and then westward towards the Yellowstone and Powder Rivers. This land would also include the Black Hills. And for a time, the Black Hills were kind of like a congregating part or spot for the Lakota. And it is still today considered to be sacred grounds by the Sioux. They would also be given roughly $50,000 for 10 years. And this is talking about the tribe, not necessarily individuals. They would also be given merchandise, domesticated animals, and agricultural implements. A handful of Lakota did sign this treaty. Still others refused to sign or to abide by it. And eventually there would be a second Treaty of Fort Laramie signed in 1868. This is during the time of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. And that probably had a big factor of why this treaty was signed. Native Americans would be given 160 acres of land to farm. That land would be adjoining to the reservations that were established. The U.S. government would construct facilities where timber and water could be obtained, so like a lumber yard and basically a water system. They would have warehousing for the goods that the government would distribute to Native Americans, and services of a doctor, a blacksmith, a miller for grinding basically grain into flour. Carpenters could also be obtained there. An elementary school that would be taught in English with a ratio of about 30 students for every one teacher. Individuals would be given seed for 1 year, and they would also be given clothing such as pants, flannel shirts, socks, hats, calico or material for dresses would also be handed out. They would receive per person, if they abided by this, $10 a year for roughly 30 years, or $20 per person for roughly 30 years if they were choosing to engage in farming. So there was a little incentive there to take up an occupation. As far as livestock, they would be given basically one cow, a pair of well-broken oxen, okay? That meaning that it would be a set of oxen that could possibly pull farm implements. It probably came to be meant more often as kind of old oxen. And then they would also be given these items within roughly 60 days of settlement onto the reservation. Native Americans would guarantee that they would not hinder the construction of the railroad. They would not attack persons, homes, livestock, of people that were friendly to the United States. They were never to kill or to scalp white men or attempt to harm them. And they had to agree to withdraw all opposition to military posts or roads now established south of the Platte River. So, needless to say, we had quite a bit of documentation here of some of the terms of these agreements. Not all the terms were necessarily abided by. So, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the struggles here, and we're going to focus first with the Dakota Sioux and some of their issues that they had in the state of Minnesota. But what agreement did the Dakota Sioux make with the U.S. government? And this goes back before probably 1862, and they primarily agreed that they would live on a smaller reservation in exchange for some kind of annual payment or an annuity, if you want to call it that, from the federal government. What frequently happened to the funds that the Dakota Sioux were supposed to receive from the government? Unfortunately, we live in a time of fraud, and some of those funds got caught up in the bureaucracy or corruption, or in some cases never reached the Dakota Sioux. And that is certainly an issue here, because eventually we found that many of our Dakota Sioux were in dire straits. So what situation occurred? Okay, or what was the situation that occurred to the Dakota Sioux in 1862? Because of the fact that they weren't getting their payments, they were in extreme poverty. They were facing starvation. For the most part, there were members of the tribe, particularly Chief Little Crow, who had asked government officials to provide food on credit, and unfortunately, some of the traders didn't comply. And the next thing we knew is that our Dakota Sioux are going to take up arms. And what's going to happen is we're going to have what is known as the Great Sioux Uprising. Chief Little Crow really wanted to focus in on just the government, focusing on fighting soldiers. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because some of his followers targeted civilians, and roughly 100 civilians were slaughtered during this uprising. And as a result, the military came in. They arrested many of the Dakota Sioux men who were involved in this. And at the height, there was 307 Dakota Sioux that had been sentenced to death. What ends up happening is President Abraham Lincoln pardons quite a few of them, and the number is reduced to roughly 38 individuals who are sentenced to death. And as you can kind of see in the illustration below, there is a gallows there, and there is quite a few men that are facing punishment. This is one of the largest mass executions that's ever going to happen in American history. So, what were some of the names of the Lakota Sioux chiefs? And you may find some of these names familiar. Red Cloud, who for the most part fought a war. There was a war named after him, the Red Cloud War, that lasted from 1866 to 1868. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. And so, how did Crazy Horse lure American troops into a deadly ambush? And this is an ambush that took place, or what would be eventually called Fetterman's Massacre. It took place actually in the state of Wyoming. And it just happened to be a situation where Captain William Fetterman and about 80 of his soldiers were kind of lured out of the fort itself. And if I remember serves me correct, I think that was Fort Kearny. They were lured out, and eventually a small raiding party, kind of got them to follow them. And eventually a very large number of warriors were waiting to ambush Fetterman and his men. And what ends up happening is word gets back to the fort. They send a messenger down to Fort Laramie asking for help. And this rider literally rides, I think, a couple of 100 miles within the course of about 24 hours, which is amazing, to basically say what had happened as far as this massacre was concerned. Number 8, why did tensions between the Cheyenne and Arapaho and the miners in Colorado begin to arise in the 1860s? And this goes back to about 1864 or so. And part of that was the fact that they were discovering gold out in Colorado, and more settlers and Native Americans were coming in contact with one another. Native Americans began raiding wagon trains, stealing cattle from ranchers. So for the most part, there was a lot of tension between these two groups. The territorial governor named John Evans had basically ordered that Native Americans surrender and return to the fort. And that didn't necessarily happen. And a guy named Black Kettle and his followers, for the most part, they didn't quite get the news that they were supposed to report at a certain date. They were a little late showing up. And what ends up happening is the fort commander tells them to wait some distance away at a place called Sand Creek. And at that period of time, Colonel John Shivington of the Colorado Volunteers ordered an attack on Black Kettle and his Cheyenne. And unfortunately, this becomes known as a massacre. And it, for the most part, makes people wonder whether or not Black Kettle was being peaceful at the time, and whether or not Shivington had gone beyond his authority. Number 9, what did the Indian Peace Commission of 1867 propose? This commission proposed the creation of 2 reservations, one primarily for the Sioux, and that would have been probably located in the Dakotas, and the other of the Native American tribes of the Southern Plains. So that would probably include groups like the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, and others who were in places like Kansas, Colorado, and down into Oklahoma. The deal is that the Bureau of Indian Affairs would run these reservations, and enforcement to get Native Americans onto these reservations would be done by the U.S. Army. Anyone who failed to report would obviously be pursued by the military. And this is what's going to set the stage for a handful of wars that we're going to see on the Great Plains, known as the Indian Wars. So, number 10, what conditions faced Native Americans who moved to the reservations? Reservations, just as we're kind of going on here, were nothing new. I mean, we have had reservations throughout the Americas even before the founding of this country. But at the time that we're talking about, these reservations were very dire. There was poverty, despair, a lot of corruption when we talk about those people who were managing the forts and a lot of the supplies that would come into these forts. So it was unfortunate that Native Americans were kind of forced onto these reservations under such conditions. The painting I want to show you right now is one that was on the previous slide, but it's kind of famous, and it might give you an understanding of maybe some corrupt issues that were going on at this period of time. The painting is of Pigeon's Egghead, who was the chief that you see here, and actually it's kind of a before and after image, if you want to call it that, to go to and to return from Washington, D.C. And if you take a look at the little image on the left here, you might see a building in the background. That would be our U.S. Capitol. If you take a look at Pigeon's Egghead, you'll notice he's in his buckskins. He has his peace pipe. He's wearing his moccasins. He's wearing, for the most part, a traditional headdress. In his arms, he's carrying a buffalo robe. Very traditional way of life. If you're kind of looking at that, the flip image of when he returns, and you can kind of see the teepees in the background and such, is that of a man who's kind of become a little more worldly. He's wearing a military uniform. He has boots on. He's carrying a saber. He has an umbrella and a fan in his hands. If you take a look a little closer at the image on the right that's been zoomed in a little bit, you'll see that he's smoking what looks like a cigarette. And in the back pockets, he has bottles of alcohol. In a way, this might be indicative of some of the things that happened when we talk about the exposure to the settlers that were coming to the West and how life was going to change for our Native Americans. Number 11, how did the newspapers portray the death of General or George A. Custer? And I want to talk a little bit about Custer and his last stand. Custer, for the most part, If you take a look at the image below here, there's a painting, and it kind of shows Custer with a couple of revolvers in his hands, kind of fighting off the Lakota Sioux. But it all goes back to a little bit before 1876. At the beginning of the 1870s, there was gold that was discovered in the Black Hills, and as a result, we're going to have a gold rush and lots of prospectors heading to what would have been Sioux territory. And as a result of that, the Sioux are going to see that their treaty has been broken. They have no reason to abide by the treaties of Fort Laramie, and we have an insurgency that's going to spark. Um, in the summer of 1876, there was a number of skirmishes that happened between the U.S. Army and the Lakota. And some of the battles that we're going to talk about, like the Battle of the Rosebud, kind of leads to this Battle of the Little Bighorn. But needless to say, Custer got in over his head. And eventually, the way the newspapers are going to portray this is that his death was basically a massacre. Truth may be is that Custer might have made a very fatal flaw. He had scouts that were riding with him that day, and the Little Bighorn, which is the river that kind of cuts through this battleground, is kind of noted as an encampment site, sometimes known as the Greasy Grass. And the Lakota actually had established one of the largest nomadic gatherings at the Greasy Grass that had ever been seen. And the scouts had told Custer and some of the other Army officials that you could probably count the number of stars in the sky, and there would still probably be more Native Americans. They highly advised against attacking at that site. And unfortunately, Custer went ahead with the attack and eventually is going to succumb in the battle. Moving ahead, number 12, what was the ghost dance? Well, the ghost dance was a ceremonial ritual that was performed by the Lakota. And this goes back really before the wars that we're talking about. But the goal was that this dance was going to bring back the buffalo. It would hopefully not only that return the land and maybe make the settlers disappear and pretty much allow the Lakota to reunite with some of their dead ancestors. If you take a look here, the men that are dancing in this image are wearing kind of a buckskin shirt. And supposedly, under this tradition of the ghost dance, as they're dancing, this will supposedly make the warriors who are doing the dance bulletproof to the white men. And needless to say, there were some Army officials that were quite frightened by this whole event. As a result of that, the government banned the ghost dance because they thought it was going to lead to more violence. One of the men who happened to be involved in this was a guy named Sitting Bull. And this is kind of linked to how he dies. But how did Sitting Bull die? Well, he was shot in an exchange of gunfire between Indian police, her supporters of the federal police, who were trying to arrest him. Chief Sitting Bull was going to go and participate in the ghost dance, and I think there was a great fear that if one of the more renowned leaders would go do that, then there would be more trouble. As a result, we're going to have a series of events that are going to take place. Within weeks, we have a massacre at a place called Wounded Knee. And this occurs on December 29th, 1890. This is kind of considered the last battle of the Indian Wars. And it certainly was one of the ways that they brought an end to this Indian dance or this ghost dance. What were some of the provisions of the Dawes Act of 1887? And the Dawes Act basically was kind of like a homestead act in many cases. The difference is that we're going to ask Native Americans to take up farming in exchange for land. They're going to be given actual properties that were kind of cut out of the reservation. If they would take up farming, then for the most part, they would get a few more privileges. As a result of the land that was not kind of used for farming, that land would be sold to any type of homesteader who would want to live on that. There's a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson who wrote a book called The Century of Dishonor, and this dates back to like the 1880s. And she considered that to be one of the worst agreements that had ever been made for Native Americans. The fact that it was really taking away their livelihood and changing their culture abruptly. One of the things that the Dawes Act really did kind of set out to do, and it's not really spelled out, but it's the idea of assimilating. And we're going to try to make basically Native Americans into white men. And by doing that, we're going to, make them into landowners. We're going to educate their children. And one of the ways that they did that is by establishing what is known as the Carlisle schools. In the photo here, you see the Indian school at Genoa, Nebraska. That's kind of an offshoot of some of these Carlisle schools, but the goal would be to remove children from their families, send them to a school, in many cases hundreds of miles away from where their families lived, and to cut their hair and to teach them English, to teach them trades, and then eventually to send them home again. Many times when young children were sent home after many years, they no longer were able to speak their Native American language, and hence there would be this generational issue that families could not speak with one another and to pass on different traditions. Throughout the United States, we still have a number of different reservations and areas where we see high populations of Native American tribes. If you look in Nebraska, we have a number of counties that have high populations of Native Americans. To our north in the Dakotas, the same can be said as well. Thank you very much.